Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Scott Gottlieb, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former Deputy Commissioner for Medical and Scientific Affairs at the FDA. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, I asked you on to help us understand why pharmaceutical pricing is so crazy. The media just went through yet another cycle of angst, this time over price increases for the EpiPen. Before we get on to the larger policy issues, take us through the history of the EpiPen. Epinephrine is a generic medication that's over 100 years old and costs about $1 a dose. Why are we even having this conversation?
Right. So Mylan purchased the product from another pharmaceutical company a number of years ago. At the time that they purchased it, it was being sold for about $57. And they've been able to take successive price increases over the years to the point where now the product's priced at $600. And the reason why it's been in the press lately is that, first of all, $600 is a lot of money. And people usually buy the EpiPen during back-to-school season. So parents are going out to buy the pen now so they can put it in their kid's knapsack. And many more people are now exposed to the full cost of their drugs because they're finding themselves on high-deductible plans or plans with very narrow formularies, and so they're paying the full freight. And so that's why it's been in the news now. The question is, why does it cost $600? And the simple answer is because there's no competition, because products that want to come to the market to compete with EpiPen haven't been able to. And at least one product that was recently on the market that did compete with EpiPen was taken off the market by the Food and Drug Administration.
Millions of diabetics give themselves injections every day, and they don't need a spring-loaded syringe.
Right.
What's wrong with schools just keeping plain old syringes and epinephrine in the nurse's office?
Well, a lot of places do that. And if you go on the internet, you'll see a lot of EMTs are doing that to get around the pricing of the EpiPen. And some parents are doing that. They're making basically makeshift EpiPens out of basically a pre-filled syringe with epinephrine in it. The EpiPen does have a lot of advantages because it can be self-administered. It can be administered by someone who doesn't have a lot of knowledge about how to use a syringe, or someone who might be scared of needles, scared of injecting needles. So a spring-loaded device like that does have a lot of advantages. And in fact, in a lot of aspects of medicine, we use spring-loaded devices just like the EpiPen to deliver different kinds of injections that might be hard to self-administer by a patient.
My understanding is the original patent for the EpiPen, the spring-loading mechanism, has gone off patent. Of course, like any good company, they've added some new features and benefits and created a new version. Why aren't there 15 competitors using the old version on the market?
Right. So one of the things that FDA says is that in order for a generic version of a product to come to market, it has to have the exact same labeling as the product that's currently on the market, the product that it's seeking to copy. And if the instructions for use in the label of EpiPen require patients to do a certain maneuver or require certain training that's just specific to that device, unless someone could copy that device exactly and provide the same exact instructions for use, they can't come to market basically piggybacking on the EpiPen. And in fact, some of the innovations and some of the changes that Mylan's introduced to the EpiPen require special instructions, and so now the label can't be just easily copied. There are ways around that. That's sort of a long bureaucratic answer about how the generic drug process typically works. Obviously, it's not working in this case. There are ways around that, and FDA can work with sponsors to develop products that might have slight variations to sort of get around the residual IP that's attached to the EpiPen, but still require instructions for use that are close enough to the EpiPen that you can allow the label to be copied, if you will. A manufacturer can also come to market by filing a new drug application, basically coming to market as if they're a new EpiPen, a new version of epinephrine.
But that's millions of dollars.
Well, it's not really, because a lot of the data around the benefits of epinephrine are in the public domain. So that really all you'd need to do to come to market with a brand new EpiPen, if you will, would be to prove that your device delivers the product in the right way, because you wouldn't have to go through clinical trials to actually prove the efficacy of delivering epinephrine in a setting of an allergic reaction. That data is widely available. You can just reference it. And that's a process called 505(b)(2). It's a separate filing process that FDA maintains to allow sort of an abbreviated route to market for devices that are different than the formulation that's currently on the market. So you can't copy it exactly, but close enough that you want to piggyback on the data that's in the public domain. In this case, the data demonstrating that epinephrine works to treat anaphylaxis.
Let me back up a little bit. You mentioned a labeling process. Did these labeling rules come down from God, or can the FDA just change the labeling rules?
Well, the FDA can't necessarily change the rules. A lot of these rules are baked into the legislation that defines the generic drug approval process. And one of the sort of tenets of the generic drug approval process is that a a generic drug has to be an exact copy of the branded drug that it's seeking to displace in the market. So that means everything needs to be exactly the same, including the labeling and including the instructions for use. I think that process has certain advantages. It also has certain limitations, and it particularly has certain limitations when you get in the realm of these complex drugs that are difficult to manufacture, difficult to deliver, where making an exact copy of the version that's on the market might not be so straightforward. And there you might want to have a process that allows for some flexibility, as in this case, but right now the legislation doesn't allow for that.
Speaking of legislation, much has been made of the fact that Mylan CEO Heather Bresch is a senator's daughter. How important is having good Washington connections for a generic drug company that wants to maintain high prices?
Well, look, I think having good Washington connections for any company that's in a highly regulated business is important. And probably there's no more highly regulated business, perhaps, than the drug business. I mean, you could think of a handful of businesses that maybe are on par with it in terms of how much the decisions that affect the industry get made in Washington or get influenced by Washington policy. I am not inclined to make too much of the fact that her father's a senator. I think people shouldn't be held liable for who their parents are, and children of politicians certainly should have freedom to aspire to whatever position they want. So I wouldn't make too much of that. And if you take a step back and just look at Senator Manchin's career, he's been on the other side of these kinds of issues quite a lot. He's been pretty pro-consumer and pro-generic in his career, so I wouldn't say that he's taken positions that necessarily favored Mylan's in this case.
There's something like 9 competing products in Europe that do the same thing as an EpiPen, and they're all pretty cheap. How come they're not available in the U.S.?
They haven't gone through the FDA approval process. Those sponsors can make a decision to bring them onto the market in the U.S., but it's going to be expensive. The process for getting a generic drug approved in the U.S. has gotten more expensive over the years. And there are some of these legal hurdles I talked about related to the EpiPen and some of the uniqueness of that product and the ability to just bring a generic version onto the market. I suspect one of these companies is going to be able to work through that process, but it's not an easy process. And you made the point about having Washington connections and having know-how in Washington. Being able to get a version of a complex drug like this through the generic drug approval process requires a lot of know-how that a small generic company just isn't going to have.
Scott, in 1984, the Hatch-Waxman Act was passed to make it easier for competitors to bring drugs to market whose patents have expired. How was that bill supposed to usher in an age of inexpensive generic drugs?
The whole idea of Hatch-Waxman was to create a process where you could get to market very quickly, very inexpensively with a copy of a drug that's already on the market after the legitimate IP has expired in that drug. And so the key was keeping the barriers to market very low, making it inexpensive to develop a generic application, making it inexpensive to develop a generic drug, making it inexpensive to go through the FDA regulatory process. The problem is that it's gotten a lot more expensive and a lot more complex. And so there's fewer companies now filing generic applications, and there's fewer companies filing generic applications for drugs that might not have a lot of revenue associated with them. That might not be sort of big category drugs, because if it costs you $10 or $15 million to file a generic application and the drug only does about $20 million a year in revenue, it's not economically viable to file a generic application for that drug. And so you see a lot of very small volume drugs that are used infrequently, not facing any competition. It used to be my rule of thumb when I was at FDA, I worked there as a deputy commissioner, was a drug category would become genericized when it reached about $10 million in annual revenue, meaning that you would see generics enter the market once a drug with a patent had expired reached about $10 million in annual revenue. Now the rule of thumb is it has to hit at least $25 million in annual revenue, and maybe as much as $50 before you're going to see generics come in.
What specific factors caused the Hatch-Waxman approach to break down and the cost of FDA approval to shoot up?
Well, just that the filing costs have gotten a lot more complex and a lot more sort of strung out. FDA is asking for more data. There's more legal costs associated with filing generic applications. You also have a lot of generic applications for drugs that are more complex, so the complexity of drugs has increased over time. Hatch-Waxman was passed at a time when drugs were relatively simple, small molecule pills that you would swallow. Making a chemical substitute for one of those drugs was relatively straightforward. Now you see a lot of drugs that have unusual delivery vehicles. They might be long-acting versions of drugs that have sort of an extended release technology built in, and those things make it more complex to copy a lot of today's medicines. The medicines have gotten more complex, and Hatch-Waxman doesn't really tolerate and allow for that complexity very easily.
What role have trial lawyers played in making generic drugs more expensive?
Well, trial lawyers could have a role in making drugs more expensive very shortly. There's a regulation that FDA's promulgated, FDA's put out in draft form, that would effectively expose the generic manufacturers to the same kind of failure to warn product liability suits that now plague the branded companies. If that regulation gets finalized, it really is designed, it's artfully designed, in my words, to invite litigation. And if that regulation gets finalized, you're going to see the generic drug manufacturers subject to a lot of product liability litigation for quote-unquote failure to warn, failing to warn consumers of, emerging and newly discovered side effects with some of these very old drugs. And if that litigation does ensue, it's going to drive up the cost of the whole generic drug paradigm and filing generic drug applications.
Martin Shkreli, the hedge fund manager turned drug company CEO, became a poster boy for greed when he jacked up prices for the antiparasitic drug he was selling. He's since been hauled off in handcuffs and is awaiting trial on securities fraud, but he reacted to the EpiPen fiasco by tweeting that the government could solve the problem by starting its own generic drug company and running it as a public utility. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't agree with the idea that the government should be in the business of running a generic drug company. I mean, the reality is that these generic drug companies operate extremely efficiently. They're producing pills for fractions of a penny per pill. They've gotten their manufacturing costs down very low. They operate at tremendous scale. So this is a very efficient industry that's frankly introduced a lot of innovation, particularly on the manufacturing side. I think the system works pretty well where we have patents around branded drugs to reward innovation. Those drugs sometimes are priced very high, but as competition comes in the market, the price gets competed away very quickly. We've seen that in the multiple drug categories where a product will come to market, it'll be highly innovative, highly effective. They'll be able to price it pretty high, and then competition soon comes into the market. We saw that with the hepatitis C drugs that attracted a lot of attention because of their initially high price. And then once those patents expire and the IP goes away, we have a very competitive generic drug market. I think we need to ask ourselves why in certain parts of the generic drug market it's not working, why there isn't vigorous competition, why prices don't get competed away. That's what I think we should be focusing on. And there are some very specific problems, and I think there could be some very specific solutions.
Some critics argue that short of nationalizing the drug companies, the affordability problem could be solved using government price controls. Would that work?
Well, if the government comes in to set prices, you can rest assured they're going to set the wrong price and probably set a price that's too high. I mean, that's the experience with Medicare Part D, the new drug benefit in Medicare that I was part of launching when I worked at CMS. At the time, they wanted to come in with a quote-unquote public option, a publicly run, government-run prescription drug plan. They were proposing a certain pricing for that plan that presumably would have been a low-cost plan. Turned out that the highly competitive market for private plans produced plans that were priced a lot lower than what the government was going to come in at. And so, I think if they come in, they're going to come in at the wrong price. That's also the experience in Europe. Europe sets prices on drugs, but I could tell you for a fact that a lot of the drugs where they come out of very competitive drug categories, the prices that the Europeans pay by setting their own price and giving a take-it-or-leave-it price are actually higher than what's paid by private plans in our market who compete vigorously to offer drugs for the lowest price.
Scott, why does anyone think drug pricing will ever be rational and not subject to both gaming and political influence in a world in which the person who orders the product, the person who benefits from the product, and the person who pays from the product are three different people?
Well, that's the essential problem here, right? That the buyer and the seller don't hook up. And so you have a system with a whole series of middlemen in between who are each taking a cut and demanding certain discounts and certain rebates and not necessarily passing those on to the consumers because they don't have to, because the consumers aren't the one ultimately paying for the product and aren't the ones ultimately demanding the best price. You're relying on an insurance company to negotiate on your behalf, and the insurance company doesn't always have in mind the desire to get the lowest price. They have other motivations as well, including the fact that they distribute a lot of these drugs and get paid to distribute them. So they make more money as more drugs are used.
Well, Scott, it's a very complicated problem. Thanks for shedding some light on it, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Dr. Scott Gottlieb, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former deputy commissioner for medical affairs at the FDA, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, we'll speak with Victor Bernson, Vice President and General Counsel of Americans for Prosperity, about his fight with California Attorney General Kamala Harris. Stay tuned.